Hi, friends and comrades, and welcome to another episode of the End of Sport podcast. My name is Nathan Kalman-Lamb, and I am joined today by my friend Priyansh. Priyansh, how you doing?
I'm doing well, and I'm so excited for this conversation. This has been a few weeks in making, so we're really keen to talk about Mexico and football and whatnot. Yeah.
We are so excited to welcome today Alexander Aviña, who is an associate professor of Latin American history in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at Arizona State University. His book, Spectres of Revolution Peasant Guerrillas in the Cold War Mexican Countryside, from Oxford University Press, was awarded the Maria Elena Martinez Book Prize in Mexican History. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. In solidarity with Derek, having suffered through Toronto weather last week, it's awful. So I hope they survive, get through this stretch of horrible weather.
It couldn't be more opposite to, Arizona State. I can imagine being in Arizona, right?
This is a time of year to be in Arizona. It's perfect. So it was really nice to come back to like mid 70s weather. Yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right. Well, listen, the majority of this conversation is going to focus on Mexico and the World Cup, right? Because we're actually really, there's been a huge amount, rightfully, a huge amount of conversation about the U.S. in this World Cup. And because, we're located, a lot of us are located here in Canada, we're talking about a bit like the Canadian angle, but the Mexico piece is essential, right? And so we're incredibly excited to get into that. But I think before we do, I think that listeners would probably be annoyed with us, given the kind of huge amount of publicity around it, if we didn't make sure to ask you about the Super Bowl halftime show. So we're kind of just curious to hear, what was your reading of Bad Bunny's performance? Was it a radical pan-American anti-colonial political intervention or something else?
It was a fun show, right? Like I don't expect the world's most popular musical artist to lead the revolution, to be part of the revolutionary vanguard to overthrow the system, right? So I thought it was a really fun show. I do think culturally it has because of who Bad Bunny is, because the linguistic issue, because of the visual representation of just Latin America within the U.S. I mean, that obviously has a cultural impact. It obviously pissed off the right to the point where they're saying, citing the halftime show in Spanish is evidence of the erasure of white culture, as a recent U.S. government official testified to the Senate yesterday or 2 days ago. So it was, I had a lot. I mean, I'm a Bad Bunny fan, so I had a lot of fun watching him as a performer. Like I like him as a performer; he's a great performer. But it was really cool to see the visual representation of Latin America within the United States, and that constant reminder that the United States is not America, right? The Americas, it represents the entire Western Hemisphere. And I think in the end, it was pretty like tame, right? Like he said, God bless America. He's really calling for to a certain extent, re-evoking Jose Marti's Nuestra America essay from the late 19th century. But it for me, just watching the freak out is kind of funny. But honestly, it was a good show. He's a great performer, and I had a lot of fun watching it. Like I wanted to watch the Super Bowl for the halftime show, not for the actual game. So I don't think I was alone.
I mean, I was in a similar place. I didn't even watch the Super Bowl, and I missed the halftime show. But in the morning, the first thing that I did on Monday morning was open YouTube and catch the halftime show. But uh, you know, as opposed to the Super Bowl, when the World Cup comes around, we'll be really into the football. I know you follow football closely, and spoken about the history of football on different shows. Um, I was really curious to, have you join us for this conversation because so much ink has been spilled, on thinking about this World Cup from the perspective, particularly of the US, like Nathan was saying, but also, there are some now increasing reports about what it means for Canada. How do you view this World Cup from the perspective of Mexican football and its history in the game? I mean, the one thing that, someone who's followed football all his life, that's the one thing that I used to always be amazed at while growing up was, wow, Mexico hosted two World Cups within 16 years. That's unusual. And now the World Cup is coming back to Mexico after 40 years. So how are you seeing this from, the perspective of Mexican football specifically? Yeah.
Well, it's no surprise that in a NAFTA World Cup, Mexico is going to be treated as kind of like the junior partner, politically and economically. Even though in the world of football, as you mentioned, Mexico has hosted two World Cups, in my opinion, two of the most successful World Cups. The 1970 World Cup gave us the best national team performance of all time, and in 1986 World Cup gave us the best individual performance of all time with Brazil in 70 and Diego Armando Maradona in 1986. And really, the 86 World Cup was improvised because I think it was Colombia who had won the World Cup, and there was a cholera outbreak, and in the last minute or toward the last moments, FIFA awarded it to Mexico after Mexico had just suffered a catastrophic earthquake in 1985 that killed more than 10,000 people in Mexico City, ruined large parts of the city. But within a year, they had managed to, and this it's a complicated story, a story of a lot of political corruption. But nonetheless, the country was able to pull off a World Cup in really difficult circumstances. And I actually, as a kid, I was living in Mexico during that time. I remember the earthquake. My family lived in Michoacan, which is about let's say like an 8-9 hour drive from Mexico City. But the earthquake, we felt the earthquake and the aftershocks. And I remember one of my earliest memories, right, walking past newsstands and just seeing like the photographs on the front page of newspapers of just like carnage. And then a year later, I still remember the 1986 World Cup music, and I vaguely remember, I don't remember watching specific games, but I do remember Maradona, right? My dad talking about Maradona. So in the world of football, like Mexico is elite, right? And when it comes to hosting the World Cup, so it is this interesting dynamic now that the third time that the country's hosting it, it's really treated as kind of like the lesser of the three nations. But again, I think that's just a reflection of NAFTA. It's a reflection of power relations and asymmetry that exists on North America. When in the world of football, like you would think that Mexico would be the top country in this setup.
And just you mentioned that that this is a kind of a NAFTA World Cup, but can we think about the donor doctrine in relation to this World Cup as well? Would you say, how is like the current situation, especially in terms of U.S.-Mexico relations? How do you think that's playing out, as we lead up to the World Cup?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the contradictions of NAFTA is this North American Free Trade Agreement that's enacted in the early 1990s. It's now called USMCA. The big contradiction there is you supposedly have the free flow of capital and commodities across these national borders at the same time that these same borders are militarized to prevent the free flow of migrants, particularly from Mexico into the United States, because the policymakers behind NAFTA knew that the introduction of U.S. capital and U.S. goods, particularly U.S. government subsidized agricultural products, were going to displace millions of smallholder Mexican peasants. So you got to put up the walls and you got to put up the border police to prevent people from coming into the U.S. And I think that contradiction continues to play out even in the discussion about the World Cup. Like, how are Mexican fans going to come in? How are Mexican fans able to come into the United States to enjoy the World Cup? I mean, it's beyond Mexico, right? Like at this point, it's the entire world is facing something similar. Like, why are people going to want to come to the United States if they're going to have to submit 5 years worth of social media history to prove that they're not quote unquote terrorists or anti-American? So you have this, I mean, on the one hand, it's an opportunity for Canada and Mexico to be like, hey, why don't everyone come and watch the games in our countries? But they host a tiny minority of the games relative to the United States. So I think that's one big contradiction. I wish another contradiction is the lack of, from the Mexican side, particularly from the Mexican national team side, the lack of speaking out against these dynamics, right? So recently they asked the Mexican national team coach, El Vasco Aguirre, to say something. They asked him a question in a press conference to comment on ICE and the violence against migrants in the U.S., and he refused to do so. He's basically said, I'm just a soccer coach. I don't know what's going on. I mean, that's shameful. I haven't really heard anything from any of the national team players from the Mexican side say anything. And we've had something from the U.S., right? Particularly Timothy Weah, and then we've seen the backlash, which is like pretty much shut up and dribble. But in terms of the Don Road doctrine, I mean, it's a weird contradiction. You're inviting people from throughout the world to enjoy the world's most popular sport, the world's most popular sporting event, at the same time that you're waging a war on Latin America and you're waging a war on migrants. So how is this going to play out? I mean, you're going to have ICE stationed outside of stadiums. So on the one hand, I think it provides a really good opportunity for popular movement and popular protest to elevate this issue even more so than it has been done within the U.S. But it's going to create havoc, man. I worry about people getting caught up in one of the new 150 ICE detention centers that have been leased since late last year and are in the process of getting set up. Like, if you're a fan coming to the U.S. to try to follow your national team, what happens if you get caught up in one of these dragnets and you're like thrown into a warehouse outside of Phoenix or outside of somewhere in rural Idaho? I mean, I think that's a real concern. Also, just the idea, I mean, this is, and we can talk about it later, but this is why I think we've seen mounting conversations globally about boycotting this, particularly at least in the US, boycotting coming to the World Cup in the US, because it's frankly just I think it's dangerous. I'm not even putting politics into it, quote unquote, as if we could separate it, but like on a logistical level, it's just dangerous for people to come to the US right now. So, and it's also happening in a moment where, as part of the so-called Don Road Doctrine, Trump is waging a war on Latin America, right? We are witnessing the strangulation of Cuba. We witnessed I know international law doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't exist. It was buried in Gaza, but they kidnapped the president of a foreign nation on trumped up narco charges, Nicolas Maduro, and now he's going through the federal legal system in the United States. And they threatened that country with war in order to be able to do that. And now they're threatening Mexico if they continue to provide oil to Cuba, because the plan for the South Florida Cuban mafia, they've been working on this for decades, right? They want to strangle Cuba. They want to overthrow the government of Cuba, but in the process is going to cause mass human suffering. So it's just a really weird moment, right? So I think, as someone who is obsessed with this sport, I grew up playing the sport. I still watch way too much of it. I would be a better scholar if I didn't spend so much time watching soccer. Like, it sucks, man. It sucks to watch that this empire in decline, lashing out and waging war on migrants and sovereign nations, is hosting the world's most popular sport, and they're ruining it. They're ruining the event, to me, already.
Totally. Listen, and you covered, honestly, so many strands here. So we'll kind of, I think, pull on a few of them again, just to dig a little bit more, because that was a great kind of picture of the entire, international relations, but also sporting aspect of what's going on in this moment. And it's just actually one of the things that you said that I want to pick up on, because you were kind of talking about how we have all these contradictions, which is absolutely right. Like, this whole Trumpist kind of project, the MAGA Don Road Doctrine, whatever you want to call it, like, it is contradictory. And normally, like, if we if we have a pretty rigorous understanding, the dynamics of capitalism, we'd be like, well, listen, the incentive for the U.S. here is to, create a hospitable environment for those traveling to the tournament, right? Tourists coming to the tournament, because after all, there's a tremendous amount of money to be made. That's why they're doing it in the first place. Like, obviously, they're going to roll out some kind of red carpet. Not to. I'm so cricket pilled now that I want to analogize cricket all the time. But like we've been talking about like the Pakistan India in cricket, right? And one of the things was like the tour in 2004. You can check out the Netflix documentary on this, which I obviously watched, which is the only reason I can speak about this. But there's. In 2004, it was a big deal that, Pakistan hosted India for the first time in quite some time. And there had been all this like trepidation about what was going to happen to all the Indian folks who were coming, including journalists, family members. Like, it was like tens of thousands of people actually who were coming to Pakistan at that time. And they were like, can we even do this? Right? Like, these people are going to be clearly unsafe. And not to get into whether that was like a correct concern or not, but the point of I'm trying to get to is Pakistan did roll out the red carpet, and the experience that those folks have was like, this is unbelievable. Like, this country welcomed us. We had the time of our lives, because there was an incentive for that. It makes sense that you would do that if you're hosting a mega event, right? That's the point of it. But we can't trust this Trumpist regime to do that, because we know that they're constantly in contradictory ways undermining their own position. Why are they deporting the very people that they need in agricultural fields, right? To support the entire, food economy of the United States? Why are they going into, Korean automobile plants and getting rid of the worker? It doesn't add up. Their ideological commitment to white supremacy is contradicting their own capitalist imperatives, essentially, is what is happening here to a significant degree.
No, yeah, I mean, nothing to disagree with. I mean, what you said, Nathan, I mean, I think that's totally right. I think part of what explains perhaps the contradiction is that the Trump administration, the way I see them, and one way to understand the contradiction is that they're just like, they're stripping the country for parts, right? I think this is a particular form of a particular model plundering. Well, I guess all models of capital accumulation are about plunder, but like this is like a very personalist, like very direct way of just mass amounts of corruption, and they're stripping the country for parts, right? So that's why they can justify implementing really contradictory policies that you would think would cut into their bottom line, or it would, destroy the labor market in the United States, or leave, segments of the U.S. economy in tatters, because, like the service industry or the agriculture industry depends so much on so-called legal and illegal migrant labor, right? But because they're like in this to strip the country for his parts, like I don't think they really care, right? And then you combine that with, a particular white revanchist project, right? That before Trump came into power, there was years of alleged anti-white violence that they somehow are reacting against, right? Like this victimization, which is so insane to me, right? The myth of, it's almost like the myth of white genocide was 10 years ago was so ridiculous, has become an operating or motivating ideology for these people, right? And you see it with like Stephen Miller. So that's another way to kind of, that's what takes priority over some of the obviously bad economic policies that they're implementing, like tariffs, like completely destroying the large segments of the labor market in the United States, which obviously is manifested in higher prices for American consumers. And right now I feel like we're teetering on some sort of like economic disaster that may or may not happen. Who knows when it's going to happen. And then you combine that with, particular political constituencies like South Florida, which they've been waging their own form of revanchist, anti-communist, anti-black, anti-brown war against Latin America, right? Because that part of the country has been nourished by subsequent waves of Latin American exiles who objectively lost revolutionary political processes in their countries. They have the means to come to the United States, and then they use Florida as some sort of like counter-revolutionary base of operations to wage war against the countries that they are always proclaiming they love so much. They love them to death, right? I mean, that's the thing. If you listen to the Cuban House of Rep members right now from South Florida, they love Cuba so much they're willing to starve every last Cuban so they can take power back. It's insane. It's an insane dynamic. So all these I think these factors all help kind of explain some of the contradictory things that we witnessed since Trump took power early last year in 2025. And one thing that I think about too is the difference between how also ostensibly liberal institutions reacted to his first presidential victory. And this is where you get like the hashtag resistance and people are all out in the streets and willing to push back against Trump. I remember when right after he won the first time, there was a World Cup qualifying match between Mexico and the U.S. And before the match started, the U.S. and Mexican national teams did this whole show of solidarity, right? They basically said everything's going to be all right. It's a very, you guys know, it's a very tense rivalry for soccer, but they showed it was a really interesting representation of unity that was forced by the presidential victory of Trump the first time around. What did we get the second time around? We get Christian Pulisic doing the Trump dance when he scores, right? So and we have liberal institutions completely just laying down for Trump, whether it's universities, whether it's the I think the legal system is probably one of the only ones that has stood up to him. But you have universities already at obeying before they're even forced to. So it's really weird dynamic, right? And I think that's also fueling or shaping the way that this World Cup is going to play out on the ground in the U.S. In addition to other stuff, other like long-standing problems of like any major sporting event, whether it's the World Cup or like the Olympics, these are all huge plundering opportunities, right? Like as you said, Nathan, these things are being organized because they make a lot of money. And they usually leave local communities that host these sporting events in terrible financial and fiscal situations once the event ends and people go home. And this is actually one of the dynamics that's being played out in Mexico City right now, but we're going to see it in Canada as well and in the United States.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's pick up on that because I think, and we're going to keep the conversation obviously about sports, but part of it is like one of the weirdest political relationship between these NAFTA nations in our lifetimes, right? I would say, like all three of us similar age. And I mean, obviously NAFTA has been a relationship that has been, all about exploiting Mexico, right? Like there's a way in which like the exploitation of the labor of Mexicans is like a huge part of what fuels the project. But there has been like a fairly solid political relationship consequently, because there's this perceived flow of value and so forth that is like, again, based on the capitalist class across all three countries, viewed as mutually beneficial, right? And suddenly that's fracturing in a really shocking way, because it's happened so quickly, obviously. And it's not, obviously we know this is part of the Don Road Doctrine. It's like it's happening with Europe, obviously. There's the whole Greenland piece. Like we're seeing it, obviously the Venezuela and Cuba, not less surprising, because those are relationships with a history of, American violence. But what I want to get into a little bit, because I think it's really curious, is how sort of differently Mexico and Canada have responded to this, right, in this moment. We have Canadian Prime Minister Carney on the one hand, famously talking about his elbows being up. He delivers this Davos speech suggesting that U.S. hegemony has somehow collapsed. That's obviously seems like a lot of bullshit, but the least bullshitty part of it is there's actually a relationship that's expanding with China, right? That was the real shocking twist for me, right? That shows that there's some substance to what Carney's talking about, because that would have seemed almost impossible, a few months ago, even. But at the same time, clearly, he has also remained conciliatory and accommodationist in many ways with Trump, right? I know we'd be totally remiss in not acknowledging that that's mostly what Canada's been doing. But I would say it seems like, from where I sit, and I may be wrong about this, that Mexico's leader, Sheinbaum, has struck a much more defiant tone in relation to, or at least like an authentically defiant tone. I would be curious to ask, how has Mexico responded to Trumpism? Again, because after all, the majority of those being targeted by MAGA secret police are people of Mexican descent. And then so just in general, what is the current state of play between these two countries? And I guess, if we want to bring it back to sports, do you think that that's going to kind of, that those fissures might manifest a little bit more as the World Cup comes closer?
It's a really difficult question, right? I think it's a long. The U.S. has historically tolerated brash, loud Mexican assertions of sovereignty. I mean, this is like, so what Sheinbaum has done publicly fits a longer historical pattern where the U.S. has generally allowed Mexico to publicly assert its nationalistic claims over its own sovereignty, which is what she's doing now. But then when it comes to actually doing something about it, or when it comes to kind of like hidden transcripts, like stuff we'll find out decades on from like declassified documents, you see that there's a really close collaboration between Mexico and the United States, right? So we see this really clearly, for instance, during the Cold War. Like we now know that like 4 Mexican presidents from the 60s and 70s were on the CIA payroll. So while Mexico was positing itself as like a leader of the global South, it was tried to posit itself as as a leader of the non-aligned movement. We know now that like Mexican presidents were working with the United States, and in particular, we have really good declassified documents that highlight a couple things. One, Mexico was the only Latin American country that didn't sever diplomatic or economic relations with Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. And that Mexican government used that, right, to say we are a sovereign nation, we make our own decisions. But now we know publicly, thanks to the work of like historian Renata Keller, like secretly, Mexico essentially was working as a spy for the U.S. in Cuba and then passing intel over to the U.S. government. Like we know they were doing that. Or by the time we get to the 1970s, during the presidency of Luis Echeverria, who's the president of 1970, 1976, he was really, he tried to become the president of the UN. He's the one who led the charge in the UN to categorize Zionism as racism. He was very nationalistic and leftist. Mexico received lots of exiles and asylum refugees from South American countries that were experiencing state terrorism and military dictatorships. But now we have all these documents of him meeting with Nixon, where he's telling Nixon, listen, if you don't support me, then Castro is going to take up the flag of progressivism and reform in Latin America. So who do you want to be carrying the flag? Me, who's working with you secretly, or Fidel Castro? So what I worry about is that the part so Sheinbaum has been publicly asserting Mexican sovereignty. She's pushing back against U.S. efforts to not let her ship like humanitarian aid to Cuba, which she has done. Two Mexican naval warships just arrived in Cuba, but she has accepted the U.S. pressure to not send any oil to Cuba. But what's going on behind the scenes, right? What's going on in those hidden transcripts is something that obviously when it comes to, let's say, counter-narcotics operations, they're still closely collaborating. There's a lot of questions of how, certain drug, quote unquote, Mexican drug kingpins have been captured, where they're U.S. agents on the ground, et cetera. So the part that we're not seeing, I think there's less acrimony and disagreement that we're witnessing publicly. And even for Trump, like publicly, Trump, it's really interesting the way he talks about Carney versus the way he talks about Sheinbaum. He talk about Sheinbaum in like glowing terms, right? She's a great woman, she's a brave woman. But then he'll say, and this is how he resolves that contradiction, he'll say, well, she's a great leader, but she's scared of the cartels because the cartels are running Mexico, and that's why we keep offering help. She just keeps saying no. Whereas with Carney, it's just complete disrespect. Like there's nothing good there, right? It's like, we're going to invade you and make you the 51st state. Which when I was in Canada, I saw some students at York University wearing buttons that had the 51 with a line through it, which was like, okay. But it's also interesting to think about, like, when Trump talks about invading Canada, he talks about making it into the 51st state. When he talks about invading and attacking Mexico, there is no such effort, right? We just want to supposedly wipe out the narco labs and the drug cartels, which is, there's obviously a racial dynamic at play, and that's a racial dynamic that goes back to the U.S.-Mexico War. There's what saved Mexico from not losing more than half of its national territory was some Southern politicians being so racist that they're like, no, we don't want to incorporate Mexicans into the United States. So let's just take the sparsely populated northern half and leave the other half intact. So yeah, but I think there's stuff that's happening behind the scenes that we're not aware of, particularly in the realm of security. Right now, some of the stuff I'm reading in Mexico, they place the blame, more leftist takes critiques of Sheinbaum's administration will place the blame on Omar Harfuch, who's kind of like her main security official. He's a cop. He comes from a long line of dirty war torturers and executioners. So like, it's kind of weird that he's a third generation. His grandfather was a general. His father was a really shady head of the secret police in Mexico that was disbanded in the mid 80s because they were protecting narco trafficking organizations. But he's young, he's fresh faced, he's handsome, and he's willing to play ball with the Americans when it comes to security matters. So through that area, I think we can see a lot less acrimony, a lot more collaboration than many of us would more so than many of us would like to see. Like for me right now, I'm just like, send the oil to Cuba, right? Because one thing that we've learned about Trump and the Don Road doctrine, like you can't appease this guy. He's just going to take more and more. So if you don't put like an alto, if you don't like say enough, like he's going to continue to take, right? So if Mexico's really interested in demonstrating its sovereignty in political and geopolitical terms, it would send oil to Cuba, which is a really easy thing to do, right? You're saving a people from being starved to death and to suffer, to not get medical care because they're running out of fuel. So send the oil. But, obviously, again, for me, I'm not responsible for 150 million people, so it's easy for me to say that. But I mean, I think that's what's a lot of the left, at least, and progressives in Mexico would like to see.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I know. I've been thinking about the same thing. Like you're torn because, like, when it comes to this question of accommodationism, right? Like what you're saying, how many people are you responsible for? Because, like, of course, like it's abhorrent to imagine accommodating Trump in any way. Like it's like this is like just a vicious, extractive, bullying regime. So like the default response is, of course, like resist. But when actual sovereignty is threatened, and given the nature of U.S. power, right? I mean, there's like a real threat. If these threats of annexation are actually real, you're actually probably better off remaining sovereign and somehow accommodating this regime, right? Than pushing them so far that you become annexed. That's what Canadians, I think, to a certain extent, have been thinking about, right? Like, and so, but yeah, Canadian. But you're right, though. What you said about what you saw, Canadians are. I've never seen anything like it. Like Canadians are really mad about the 51st state stuff.
But that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing. I mean, you're right, and then that's what Venezuela is doing right now, right? You see a lot of chatter online from certain quarters on the left that are really castigating the current Venezuelan government. And Mike, I'm like, what do you guys expect them to like? What are you expecting them to do at this moment? Realistically, on the ground, right? Like, in October of 2023, I tweeted something and I'm like, I'm really glad Twitter wasn't around during the Haitian Revolution, because a lot of the Haitian Revolution, to my mind, which is still the most radical movement revolution in the history of Latin America, if it had happened now, you would have people online saying it was the opposite. Like at one point, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, he defected to the French. Like, what would the Twitter left say about Dessalines, right? Like, he has a famous quote where he said, "Listen, if I defect to the French 100 times, I'm going to betray them 100 times." Like, there's a longer term strategy here, right? That I think some of us who lack access to real clear information should keep that in mind and be a little humble, right? Analytically, that obviously social media doesn't encourage that, but yeah. So accommodation is one particular strategy. I just think that what we've learned since October 2023 is that if you don't stop a genocidal power, they're going to continue to commit more genocide. So for Mexico, it would behoove them to, kind of set a line and then at the same time try to organize support within the region. Because historically, the only way you stop the U.S. empire in the Americas is when you have some semblance of a unified Latin America. And if Canada gets involved finally for the first time, then that would actually be a really helpful thing as well.
No, you're right. Exactly. And that's ultimately what we need to see. And the truth is about Trump that like, I mean, this not to like, it doesn't reduce to like a personality analysis or something. That's like a stupid way of thinking it through. But like, he is just like such a conventional bully, though, in a sense that it's like so tempting to do that. It's like when people that's the whole taco thing. It's like when people push back against him, he does kind of back down, right? So like showing a bit of a spine does seem like, you're literally saving people from genocide, and probably you're going to get the outcome that you want too on your own sort of domestic front. So yeah, like, there's a lot of bad options available, but yeah, in this moment, like we got to listen to Bad Bunny here, right? Like the Americas do have to we have to cultivate some kind of non-U.S. Pan-Americanism that will, be a counterweight. But like we could talk about that for a long time, but we got you. I want to really focus more a little bit on Mexico right now, because you already started delivering like a really fascinating kind of historical lesson for us. And I'm sure that, like me, a lot of our listeners are like not as fluent in Mexican history as we should be. So could you kind of like talk us through a little bit, paint a picture about the ideological shift that was represented by the rise of AMLO and Sheinbaum's Morena party? How do you assess its emergence and the extent to which it is committed to socialism? You've already gestured to the fact that like Mexican leftists have been critical, for instance. So like, but I think that's like really important, because this is like a major shift in the Mexican political climate.
Yeah, I think, well, to start, I would say that Morena represents within the limits and the confines of the current geopolitical and economic moment. It's a social democratic movement in a world where you have a unipolar power, more or less. In a American world, broadly defined, where the U.S. remains the dominant power. How do you establish some sort of social democratic rule? I think Morena has pulled that off. Morena so let me say a couple of things about Morena. Morena, it presents itself as a historically consequential rupture in Mexican history. So when AMLO wins the presidency in 2018, he talked about Morena's landslide electoral victory of representing the fourth transformation in Mexican history. The first being the independence, the second being the ascendancy of Mexican liberals in the 1860s and 70s. The third being the 1910 Mexican Revolution, which was the 20th century's first mass peasant social revolution globally. And that third transformation produced something really important. It produced a constitution in 1917 that at that moment was the most radical constitution in the world until the Bolsheviks showed up later that year. But for its moment, it was a radical social democratic constitution that was not just concerned with expanding political rights for all Mexicans, minus electoral rights for women at that moment, but it was also concerned with social rights and economic rights. So, and it asserted an economic nationalist platform for the country to follow. So it allowed the state the power to determine how to control and regulate and place limits on capitalism within Mexico. And it made, importantly, the land and subsoil minerals patrimony of the state. They became nationalized, leading to the famous expropriation of oil in 1938. So Mexico, from 1938 until 2013, had nationally owned oil, because the idea, again, is this strategically vital commodity should be for the benefit of all Mexicans, not for private companies, domestic or foreign. So that's the third transformation. And then in humble terms, AMLO and Morena say, we're the fourth transformation. And what he meant by that is that they were a reaction to the emergence of neoliberalism in Mexico beginning in the early 80s, when Mexico became then the biggest sovereign nation to default on its debts. And that then opened the country up for Wall Street banks and the IMF to come in and say, listen, we'll give you loans to pay off pre-existing loans, but you have to deregulate your economy. You have to privatize everything. You have to cut social spending. So the way that AMLO always positioned himself politically, even when he was mayor of Mexico City in the 2000s, was to say that he was part of a movement that was pushing back against neoliberalism, that pauperized the Mexican population, that created a new class of millionaires and even billionaires, but immiserated the masses. And so in that sense, Morena is a social democratic movement. Sheinbaum talks about conscious capitalism, or a capitalism with a human face. So that's why you have socialists within this movement. And that's something else to signal about Morena. Morena gets founded as a political party in 2011, 2012, against, and defines itself as an outside party against a decrepit political system that included the PRI, which was the Party of Mexico that ruled from 1929 to 2000. It included the PAN, which was a right-wing party that ruled Mexico from 2000 to 2012. And then this other little leftist party, the PRD, that right now has basically disappeared, but was a spinoff from the PRI in 1988. And almost, I mean, they did win the election, and the PRI cheated because they said that the electoral system in Mexico, they said se cayó, it fell, it like turned off. So that the computing system that was tabulating the votes showed the PRD candidate way ahead. The system collapsed, and when they rebooted it, oh, look, the PRI candidate is somehow miraculously ahead. So there's a famous quote about se cayó el sistema, the system fell apart, the system broke down. So Morena was able to posit itself as an outside political force within a decrepit political party system, in which many Mexicans had seen very little difference between the three parties. But the other thing that made Morena really powerful is that it did emanate from different social movements. And this is one of the reasons why AMLO was so popular and Sheinbaum remains super popular to this day. It's not just a political party, but it emanated from different social movements that had a critique of neoliberalism. And after 2006, had a very severe critique of a war on drugs that was initiated by then President Felipe Calderón, that militarized the Mexican government's approach to drug interdiction. Basically, they just sent the Mexican army out to wage war against Mexicans. And to date we have more than 500,000 homicides since 2006. And we have right now, I think 125,000 disappeared peoples as a consequence of this conflict. So Morena won because they represented, or they talked about representing, a way out of neoliberalism and a way out of this war on drugs that had just completely destroyed a large swath of the country. AMLO wins, landslide victory 2018. He, in Mexico, president serve a one-term 6 years long. And then Sheinbaum wins the election 2024, and an even bigger landslide victory. She won almost all but one electoral district. So she even won the most conservative parts of the country. She won a supermajority in the lower house of Congress, and she went in the Senate. They came within 2 or 3 seats of a supermajority in the Senate. So politically, there is no doubt about where Mexicans want the country to go. And this has led to things like increases in the minimum wage, social welfare spending, direct cash transfers to the most needy and impoverished of the country. Parts of my family in rural Mexico and Michoacan, they used to be more they're very Catholic. So they were on the PAN, the right-wing party. And then once those cash transfers and scholarships started arriving, they're like, oh no, we are big Morena people now. So and the other interesting thing about Morena is that the name, so it's an acronym. It's like the Movement for National Regeneration. But the acronym Morena appeals to a racialized understanding of Mexico. So Morena is like dark skin, right? So they would say, we are the masses, like the real Mexicans, the masses of Mexico, the people who make Mexico go are the dark skinned masses, not the, as AMLO would have said, the conservatives, or he called them fifis, like the stuck up people. But then Morena also plays on another level, and this speaks to AMLO's interesting religious ideas. Morena also is an allusion to the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? The dark-skinned virgin that, as the story goes, appeared in Mexico in the 1530s to an indigenous peasant man, Juan Diego. And the Virgin of Guadalupe really becomes, the dark-skinned version becomes a symbol of Mexican Catholicism. So like Morena has also been very good at tying into issues of race and religiosity, popular religiosity, that has also helped make it seem like it's the party of the people. In addition to some, they have policies that have reduced income inequality and extreme poverty, and do present an alternative to the PRI and the PAN who ruled before them.
Thank you. I mean, that is such a great answer, because just one of the things that I think many of us who, I guess, predominantly, although I can read and understand Spanish, but still predominantly consume news in English, reading and understanding this, especially this, appreciating the significance of Morena has been a challenge over the years as well, and slowly learning more and more about it. But also interested in learning about this in relation to Mexican football, because over the past year, a couple of news items particularly caught my eye. One was how much FIFA was keen for Club America to make it to the Club World Cup. They in fact one didn't they play like a playoff game just before, and it had to do something with the fact that they wanted the broadcasters in Mexico, and you can tell us more about the financial interest at play, but also an American private equity firm now has bought a 49% stake in the club. So even though the club is, still majority owned by the Azcárraga family, which has, this kind of uh, has is probably the most powerful family in Mexican football, one could say, because they, from what I've been reading, they were the driving force even behind Mexico's bid to host the 70 World Cup and then 86, and they're still around. So what would you say are the prevailing, power lances in Mexican football? How does that fit in with the political piece that you've shared with us generously? And how has this one family, managed to retain its hold? Like FIFA presidents come and go, but the Azcárraga family just seems to stay.
All right, so I was smiling when you were talking about Club America, because to be honest, like, I'm a Club America fan. I was indoctrinated by my father. I started watching Club America during its first golden era of the mid to late 1980s, and then we recently had like a three-peat. So yeah, many like my more leftist Mexican friends cannot believe that I'm a Club America fan, but I can't help it. I grew up, I was indoctrinated, and I can't. This is my team. You feel it. So earlier I mentioned that the PRI, this political party that comes out of the 1910 Mexican Revolution, they ruled Mexico from 1929, let's say, to the year 2000. One of their pillars of control, or one of their pillars of that allowed them to wield political control for so many decades, was in the realm of culture, particularly in the realm of like television. And this is where the story of Televisa comes in, right? This family, we're in the third generation of Emilio Azcárraga right now. So the first Emilio Azcárraga Vidaurreta was I think he was a Basque immigrant to Mexico, or his parents, I can't remember. No, I think he was originally from the Basque country in Spain, arrived in Mexico in the late 19th century. And he's really the patriarch that founded, during the 1940s and 50s, something called Telesistemas Mexicanos, which was this conglomeration that started mostly with radio stations. And then by the late 40s and early 50s, because of his close links to the PRI, particularly then President Miguel Alemán, allowed him to kind of buy up radio stations and TV concessions to create a monopoly. So while Mexico had a political party that monopolized political power, they then had a nascent emerging television industry and cultural system that was also monopolized by the Azcárraga family, first by Azcárraga Vidaurreta. But really the guy, and again, it's because of his close links to political power. And Miguel Alemán, who was president from 1946 to 52, like that era of Mexican history is known for just crazy amounts of corruption and graft, particularly around the president. So it's no surprise that during that era, Azcárraga Vidaurreta was able to get favorable concessions and political support to create this television, what would become a television monopoly in Mexico called Telesistemas. His son, Emilio Azcárraga Milmo, he's the one who, there's a really good book by Andrew Paxman about, I think it's in Spanish though, only in Spanish right now. about his life. He was nicknamed El Tigre. And Azcárraga Milmo, he's the one who oversaw really the transformation of Telesistemas to Televisa during the 1960s and 70s. And Televisa becomes, to this day, I think it's the biggest mass media television company in the Spanish language in the world. It became now it's a global powerhouse for Spanish language speakers. But in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it becomes a Latin American powerhouse. And Milmo was the guy, Azcárraga Milmo, the second one, was the guy who started to watch soccer, and not necessarily because he was a fan of soccer, but because he saw its business potential, particularly when you control all the TVs and the main TV stations in the country. So he's the one who bought Club America in 1959. At that point, Club America was one of the worst teams in the league. It had a really, the connection with Bad Bunny, right? Is that Club America was founded in 1916 on Christopher Columbus Day, right? So they called it Club America for the Americas, right? But by the time Azcárraga Milmo buys them in the late 50s, they're one of the worst teams in Mexico. But he buys them as a business. He tells them, I don't know anything about soccer, but I know about business. And he ends up transforming this team into the powerhouse that it is today. But again, he's able to do it because he has Televisa is the owner of Club America. So he's also, Azcárraga Milmo is also the guy who builds Estadio Azteca in the mid 1960s. And the building of this mammoth stadium in southern Mexico City that at its peak had more than capacity for 110,000 spectators. That's what allows Mexico to get the World Cup in 1970, really. Like it's this family's connections to FIFA, but then the building of this modern new mammoth stadium, and the fact that Mexico also hosted the 1968 Summer Olympics a week after this horrific student massacre in Tlatelolco on October 2nd. All those things helped Mexico host that first World Cup. But it was that combination of access to monopolized authoritarian political power, monopolized telecommunications, television industry, and then channeling those resources into Club America and into the world of Mexican soccer that makes this family. I think you're right. I think to this day, they're probably the most influential family. Although they've been getting in trouble, right? Like the third Emilio Azcárraga Jean, he was forced to give up the titular lead, the head position of Televisa because he got caught up in FIFA Gate. So, essentially he was caught bribing FIFA to get the Spanish language rights for Televisa for I don't know how many World Cups. I think the first time he pops up in the records is like 2013 or 2014. So it takes a long time for this investigation to play out. So by 2024, he has to step back from Televisa's leadership position. And now he's just in charge of Club America. And he's a huge, the one thing I'll say about Azcárraga Jean is he actually does like soccer. And he's a huge soccer fan. And if you can put aside the fact that his grandfather and his father helped sustain a political authoritarian dictatorship for, 8 decades. Famously, El Tigre, the second Emilio Azcárraga, he called himself a loyal soldier of the PRI. So he saw soccer and a monopolized television industry as keys to sustaining PRI hegemony in the country, which is effectively what they did. The one thing I'll say about Telesistema becomes Televisa in the 1970s when they start to get into the game of satellite TV. And they start to be able to beam all their content throughout the world, not just in Mexico. And most of their content had very specific ideological messages, right? The great writer Carlos Monsiváis has a quote where he said that Televisa owned all of Mexicans' free times. And they spent that free time watching things like telenovelas. And these telenovelas, if you watch them, they all have the same plot. They all have the same ideological messages. They're all very white. And it's usually the plot involves a lesser white-skinned female protagonist falling in love with a more white male protagonist who's rich, and their union represents the unity of racial and class differences. And you have an evil mother-in-law who's always plotting against them, but at the end of the telenovela, she dies in a horrific accident or she's burned to death. I'm not kidding. Like, this is actually the plot of most telenovelas. And the ideological messages are always the same, right? It's about, within Mexico, how do you mitigate racial and class differences? It's a very cultural nationalist message. It's a very middle class, petit bourgeois cultural conservatism, emphasis on the nuclear family, emphasis on traditional gender roles. And if they talk about the peasantry, if they talk about the countryside, it's more like, oh, that's our folkloric soul. That's where we draw one aspect of our Mexican identity. But the real place for identity, beginning in the 70s and on, when Mexico becomes a primarily urban country, is in the city, it's in modernity, it's in modernization. And Televisa was really key in kind of projecting those kind of ideological messages, making, essentially mocking or teasing lower class Mexicans. Like, so one of its most popular shows becomes El Chavo del Ocho, right? El Chavo del Ocho it becomes really popular throughout Latin America. And it's a really, I don't even know how to explain it, but the main character is like an orphan kid who you just follow around in his shenanigans. He's kind of like the street urchin, the urban street urchin. So all sorts of Mexican theorists and intellectuals have spilled ink about how Televisa and just in general the type of culture that emerges after the Mexican Revolution is developed to become a really sustaining pillar of PRI political hegemony through those 7-8 decades. And again, through television, through radio, and through television, Televisa was a really crucial part of that construction.
Thanks for sharing that story. I mean, if the Televisa and football at PRI's legs are interesting. I mean, now we have one of the Club America legends, right? Cuauhtemoc Blanco, the striker. He's in the
Yes.
Mexican parliament for Morena. He's an elected representative.
He's one of my heroes, but like off the pitch, he's awful. like he was yes, before he was in the Congress, he was mayor of the city of Cuernavaca. Like, so Cuernavaca is a beautiful city, like a 45-minute drive south from Mexico City. And then he became mayor of the state in which Cuernavaca is located, Morelos. And like, it's pretty obvious that he was involved with like local drug trafficking organizations. Like, he was doing pretty horrible shit. And yeah, for someone who watched him play, it's that weird dynamic, right? Like, how do you make sense of like your hero on the pitch, and then in their post soccer life, they're just like terrible human beings whose political career looks like unblemished. Like, there's a lot of evidence of stuff that he was involved in when he was mayor and governor, but like he's still going. So yeah. I forgot to cover the last part. That foreign investment firm is related to Robert Kraft, right? So I think it's Robert Kraft's investment firm. So now America, the ownership stake of America, 51%, is still with the Azcárraga with the Azcárraga family, but 49% is with this fund that is, I think, controlled by Robert Kraft, which yikes. That's all I have to say. That's the dangerous potential. But I think Azcárraga sees the potential of continuing to globalize Mexican soccer through, again, a historically popular club like Club America. It's the most popular club in Mexico. And also, interestingly enough, and this is something that's, I think, probably unique to the U.S.-Mexico relationship, the fact that we have like almost 40 million people of Mexican heritage living in the U.S., there's a reason why the U.S.-Mexican national team comes to play their games in the U.S., or Mexican club teams come and play a bunch of friendlies in the U.S. The quality of the football is terrible, but they can charge high, they charge high ticket prices, and the Mexicans who live in the U.S. can pay those ticket prices. But that relationship has helped expand Mexican soccer beyond just the national borders, I think, in an interesting way.
Just on the subject of Blanco, I mean, even growing up in India, one of my earliest memories of watching the Mexican football team, he used to be a part for it. He's such a great striker, but obviously not the greatest story now. I mean, we've talked about a lot of the seedy aspects of football, but I also wanted to really hear you on some of the more, say, like, think about the politics of liberation in relation to football, because one thing that I've noticed in recent years, and I've been reading a bit about this, is that that there is an important place for football in the politics of the Zapatistas, right? So they have been vocal about their relationship with football, thinking about how to develop an anti-capitalist football. So I just want to hear from you, what do you think makes their version of football anti-capitalist, and why did football became big for the Zapatistas? or like, maybe its roots in the Chiapas region so yeah, just keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the Zapatistas, particularly some of its leaders and like its writers, like Subcomandante Marcos, they obviously have read and they actually met people like Eduardo Galeano, no, who's this Uruguayan writer who has to my mind is the best book on the history of soccer. I love his writings. And one of the through lines through most of his writings is that there's been a long, at this point, century-long struggle between two forces in soccer, right? The forces that are trying to commercialize it, to make it into a capitalist business that then stifles creativity and dynamism on the pitch. And then the other side, the players themselves, fan clubs, and certain, revolutionary movements who want it to remain a game based on solidarity, based on internationalism, based on horizontal relationships. And I think that's essentially what the Zapatistas, when they talk about an anti-capitalist football, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about a game that at its best, like Antonio Gramsci called it, like an open air kingdom of human loyalty. So at its best, this is a game based on solidarity, of working together, respect for your opponent, and you have fun. And it's also a game that creates insane amounts of creativity, which is that's the irony of capitalism, right? Like the people who run FIFA, the way they run this sport as a business ruins the very thing that attracts viewers to that sport, right? Like and Galeano like died, like to this very last breath, wrote about this. Every World Cup had less creative players, less dynamism, less open play. One of the things that always strikes me now is when I watch soccer on TV and a player will take his shirt off and they have that tracking technology. Like, I wonder what Galeano would say about this. Like, soccer has become like rationalized to the point where now individual players, the kilometers spent, the calories spent, the amount of movement that they spent, and where on the pitch that they were moving is now being captured and used by coaches and by trainers. Like, that's analytics, right? Like, I would have loved for Galeano to have seen the introduction of analytics in soccer to see how he would have written about it. But all this like business aspect of soccer depends on the very thing that it's getting rid of, which is that loyalty, solidarity on the pitch, creativity, dynamism. And I think the Zapatistas, when they've organized events or Subcomandante Marcos has written about soccer, that's what they're stressing. They're stressing that this is a game that can help cement solidarity locally and communally, but then also create like connections internationally. And this is why in 2004 they sent an invitation to the president of Inter Milan to send the Inter Milan team to play a game with a Zapatista team. And the match didn't happen. And the reason they even reached out, one is probably the history of Inter Milan itself, right? At Internazionale, this was a team in Italy that emerged explicitly on the idea that they were going to be drawing the best players from around the world and that borders were not going to determine who played on their team. I think the president of Inter Milan had said something in support of the Zapatistas in the early 2000s and actually donated money to their movement. And that's why they sent an invitation to him in 2004. Obviously, Inter Milan did not go to the jungles of Chiapas to play a match, but they sent money and they sent, and they created a thing where I think to this day or until recently, Inter Milan would organize like soccer training clinics in Chiapas, particularly for Chiapan girls and women. The captain of Inter Milan in the mid 2000s was El Pupi Zanetti, an Argentine player, and he organized the sending of the players. I think they sent the fines equivalent to the fines that they got for infractions in the locker room and outside. The equivalent of those fines collectively as a team, they put together and sent it to the Zapatistas, and they also gathered enough money to send like medical supplies and even like an ambulance to the Zapatistas, as the Zapatistas were trying to create this alternative society within autonomous geographies in the state of Chiapas. It was really cool. It was really cool to follow. And I was living in Mexico at the time. And it was really exciting to see soccer being talked about in a way that was non-capitalist or even anti-capitalist. And then a year later in 2005, if people can find it, you can find it readily online. Subcomandante Marcos wrote another proposal to Inter Milan where they said we should organize a tournament. And the Zapatista team was going to travel to different parts of the world. And at each game, they were going to raise funds for a group that was being attacked in that particular area. So, for instance, he the mid 2000s, this was the time of these border vigilantes, right, in the U.S. called the Minutemen, who were going after migrants. So he said, we're going to organize a game in Los Angeles, California. We're going to raise funds between Inter Milan and the Zapatista team, and we'll give the funds for undocumented migrants or people of Latino descent who are being attacked by the Minutemen. And so he had this whole thing. There was one game that was going to raise funds for Abu Amia Jamal. It was a really interesting idea, right? But again, it's that internationalist, revolutionary perspective that transcends borders, because they recognize that borders are a way to structure racial and class hierarchies within certain countries. Even though borders are ostensibly about keeping people out, they're more about structuring societies internally unequally along racial and class lines. And so how can we use soccer to kind of break through some of that? And I think what Marcos was really touching on is how soccer as an immigrant sport has really emerged also within the U.S. as a way to build local community. I saw it in my own family, my own migrant family, where the soccer team that my dad played on was all his brothers and cousins from the same part of Michoacan. And if you go to a place like Los Angeles, there's a team from each town in Michoacan, there's a team from Jalisco. And then when they play the Salvadorian teams, things get really tense. But at the same time, it's also a moment to come together and to have fun. Ultimately, a game that's really fun and a game that brings joy to me, to you guys, to billions of people on the planet. How can we recapture that is one of the struggles that the Zapatistas continue to push us to think about.
Yeah, that was a really sort of eloquent discussion of politics, within football, and great shout out to Galliano's Soccer and Sun and Shadow. And it's like, I feel the spirit of that book, like CLR James, because we talk about cricket, but CLR James is beyond the boundary. Like there's very similar spirits, right? Animating those texts in terms of thinking about the politics of the sport, the aesthetics of the sport, and how they're kind of perverted and corrupted by capitalism. So anyone who hasn't read them should. But now, okay, so let's pivot for a sort of final question. Let's pivot from like the politics of the sport to like how the sport can kind of be weaponized politically in the context, again, coming back to this World Cup, right? Because this moment where, and we've seen this, I think that there's a logical pivot that's happening here. And I think it's very productive. We've been thinking for, getting on to approximately 2 years about boycotting Israel with respect to sport in the ongoing Israeli genocide in Gaza. And I think that's like been a very important project, and it's had successes and failures, but it's been a way of mobilizing people, I think, in a meaningful sense. And there's a momentum from that, because there's a clear continuity, obviously, between the American project, which has been collaborating in that genocide, and is now sort of like, people have talked in various ways about the boomerang, et cetera. But like, we're talking about the ways in which that kind of violence is manifesting in Cuba, Venezuela, and in the U.S. itself, right? And so people are sort of think this is what an opportunity now we have, right? Because the United States is hosting, many events, right? The people have talked about the World Baseball Classic's not getting a lot of coverage for this, but probably should, given how many Latin American countries are involved, right? And the fact like where people are coming from to play those games. But the World Cup is such an enormous spectacle. It's unparalleled. So it's obviously drawing our attention. And we talked a little bit about that question. It's like a very obvious question why you'd want to boycott the U.S., but I'm curious about where Mexico fits into this, right? Because if, there's a clear demand to boycott the U.S., but then how does Mexico respond as a co-host here, or people in Mexico? Does the boycott demand apply to Mexican-hosted games as well? Or like, what, I feel the same thing in Canada, honestly. It's like, what do you do on this side of the border when you're so complicit in the event, as well as a lot of the politics? But like, where do you put your efforts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it's going to happen at this point. So it's more like you're saying that maybe we should use that opportunity to kind of use the publicity against the World Cup, by highlighting some of the more horrific things that the U.S. is involved in. I'm thinking about what, some European leftists did for the 1978 World Cup in Argentina, where they distributed really cool, like, posters and images that made visible like this horrible military dictatorship in Argentina that was weaponizing soccer to kind of distract from, its state terrorism and systematic disappearing of like 30,000 people. So I've been talking to an artist to see like, hey, can we do something similar for this? Can we use these posters and this as a model for just to raise awareness within the US to call for boycotts, but also to kind of protest and to raise awareness of what's going on, right? Particularly in the fact that we are witnessing in real time the concentration, the construction of a network of concentration camps, right? Super quickly. In Mexico, I think it's in a similar position as Canada. They're complicit. I like the way you put it. They're complicit. Though in Mexico City right now, you have very localized forms of protest and resistance because some of the quote unquote beautification projects that the Mexican government has spent like $350 million on has displaced people, particularly around the area of Estadio Azteca in southern Mexico City. So they've displaced vendors, they're trying to displace homes, they're trying to privatize public space, or they're trying to repurpose public space for the benefit of foreigners who are coming, foreign tourists, at the expense of local Mexico City residents. So for one example, they're building a 17-kilometer long bike path from the very center of Mexico City to Estadio Azteca. And it's going through neighborhoods where they're going to be displacing people that are vendors to like sex workers. And people are protesting this. So the level of complicity is obviously on a minor scale compared to what the U.S. empire is doing. But nonetheless, they're not, they're generating protests. And if people in Mexico City, I think they've already started to make connections between gentrification, displacement, the privatization of public space to what migrants are suffering in the U.S. I think if we can kind of help push along those connections, I think that would be a really productive thing. The other thing I'm thinking about in terms of complicity is that in Guadalajara, which is one of the Mexico's second biggest city, it's kind of like the Silicon Valley of Mexico. Its stadium, it's a relatively new stadium where the worst club in Mexico, the Chivas of Guadalajara, play. Like recently, at the end of last year, they started discovering clandestine graves within a 15-kilometer radius of the stadium, like 500 bags full of human remains, right? As a consequence of this drug war. So, and what drives this drug war, right? We now know that half of the 50 caliber huge rifles that cartels are using in their war in Mexico comes from one Lake City plant in Missouri. I mean, you could write a whole history of like U.S. empire in cold war Latin America by just focusing on this one factory that produces ammunition. We know that it's the insatiable drug demand from the U.S. that drives the drug war in Mexico as well, right? So, but the Mexican government has long been complicit with these processes in this political economy of narcotics, right? So I keep coming back to that, the idea that there's clandestine graves around the Estadio Akron in Guadalajara, and what that says about the Mexican government. Again, not just Morena, but really the governments also that preceded them, that actually Enrique Peña Nieto, the president of the PRI from 2012 to 2018, he's the one who really pushed FIFA to do this NAFTA World Cup, right? He's the one, not Canada and the US didn't do this, but Mexico told FIFA, we will essentially suspend all taxes for FIFA and for FIFA-linked businesses and corporations that will come to Mexico for the World Cup. The U.S. didn't do that, and Canada didn't do that. Only Mexico. And it was supposed to be for a multi-year agreement, and I think the Morena government pushed it back. They couldn't get rid of the agreement, but they reduced it to a year, if I'm correct. So the levels of complicity are all there, man. There's no way that we can say Canada and Mexico are innocent in this. Obviously, there's a question of scale. But again, an interesting thing would be how to connect local struggles in Mexico City to what's going on in Mexico City, to struggles and protests that are happening in Canada that I don't really know about or I haven't read much about, right? And I think that would be protests and making visible some of these horrific things that are happening might be an effective way to challenge the World Cup. In addition to, I mean, I have two kids and they surprised me when they told me, like, we don't want to go to the World Cup. We were planning on going to a match and they were like, we don't want to go. I'm like, okay, fine. I respect that. I like that. I mean, you guys are, because I love the World Cup. I love this sport. I really wanted to go to a game. I went to a game in 1994 when the U.S. hosted it. It's one of the best memories I have. But my young kids telling me, like, who are also soccer fanatics, are like, no, we don't want to do this. I mean, I think that's really powerful as well.
Absolutely. I mean, this World Cup will be a test for all of our fandoms because, I mean, one of the things that, when World Cup summer comes around, I mean, they've also made it difficult for football fans to follow because when there used to be 64 games, I would often pledge to watch all 64. And I think I kept it going The only time I was unable to watch all 64 was when I was in Russia as a journalist to cover it. So I was traveling between games, so I missed a few.
Yeah.
But obviously I did not care. I was I was at the games. But now with 104 games, like it's already like just logistically impossible, but also with all the politics around it, it does create this mood of
Yeah, that's a great
probably the
point.
least excited bit for a World Cup, like in my lifetime for sure. Um, and yeah, not really looking forward to it. I mean, I haven't bothered to even check tickets in because I'm based in Toronto. There are 6 games here as well. Been also following some of the interesting things that are happening in Mexico City. There's an artist on Instagram, Bloque Negro, who's been I think painting murals around the Azteca
Yep.
Stadium. And
Yeah.
I've just been thinking, like the Azteca Stadium in a football fan's imagination is I always think of the '86 World Cup, like you said at the beginning, and maybe during the World Cup, we will have something like what we saw 4 years ago, in fact, in Qatar, when there's a lot of pro-Palestine support. So maybe this time Azteca can be that side. But honestly, Alex, thanks so much for coming on the show. This is such a great conversation. I really enjoyed listening and learning from you about Mexican football and politics. And as the months lead up to the World Cup, I'm sure there'll be more to talk about, and even around the World Cup, be great to get you on the show again and talk more about politics of the World Cup.
Yeah, anytime, guys. This was a lot of fun. And this is like the one thing I could talk about forever. So thank you so much for having me on. And this was a great conversation. I look forward to it again.